Hey there, welcome back to Next Story. My name is Javier, and today I'm going to tell you two stories. The first one is called Massage Business, and it's about a physical therapist who is forced to drop a client when she is pressured into joining a sketchy business. The second one is called Wrong Dorm, and it's about a girl who is forced to cut her trip short to Seoul, South Korea, all because of the hostel she decided to stay at. Melanie, a 24-year-old physical therapist, had spent the last 3 months visiting her clients, who happened to be elderly for the most part, in their personal homes. This was all for routine rehabilitation. Most of her clients were kind, a little lonely, sure, but they were just grateful for the company and the care. One of them was an 82-year-old woman named Lynn. She lived in a government complex in a quiet corner of the city, and every Tuesday afternoon, Melanie would visit her right on schedule. At first, this seemed to be just like any other of her Tuesday appointments with Lynn, but this day, something shifted. Something just felt wrong. The building itself had really never set off any alarm bells for Melanie. It was plain but well kept. It had a security desk in the lobby, and a very loud but working elevator that would take her up to Lynn's apartment. And just like every week, Melanie would sign in with the guard who was sitting in the lobby. She would take the elevator upstairs and knock on Lynn's door. And usually Lynn would open the door and greet her with a smile and let her on in to start the appointment. Melanie would then lead her through stretching exercises and joint therapy using hand motions. Melanie would use very simple English and the help of a translator app. You see, Lynn didn't really know much English. Her main language was Mandarin, but Melanie didn't speak Mandarin, so this is the way they would communicate throughout the appointment. However, Lynn didn't live by herself. She lived with another guy named Peter, who was supposedly just a friend or perhaps a distant relative. He was in his 60s and mostly kept to himself. Most visits, Melanie couldn't even tell that he was there. She would never see him, and the only signs that Melanie would pick up on that Peter was here were any shuffling sounds coming from his room, or maybe he was doing dishes in the kitchen, or maybe just the sound of his television, but Melanie would never really see him. On this particular day, when Melanie came up the elevator and knocked on Lynn's door, Lynn didn't answer. Instead, Peter did. And he was friendly. He greeted her with a smile, and he said that Lynn was in the restroom, but she could go ahead and come on in and just wait for her, and they would begin their appointment shortly. It didn't seem strange at first. After all, Lynn was a trusted client, and she had been visiting her for months. But still, something about Peter's presence felt weird. Maybe it was the way he held that smile too long, or how he just lingered in the doorway as Melanie stepped inside. But Melanie pushed that thought aside and just told herself, we'll wait for Lynn to come out, and in the meantime, she started to set up all her equipment, getting ready for this appointment. Peter then disappeared into his bedroom and left her alone to set up her stuff. And it was quiet for a little bit, but that didn't last long. Just about a minute later, Peter came back out of his bedroom. This time he was acting different. He was a lot more animated, and he started talking really fast to Melanie. Melanie was just standing there awkwardly trying to figure out what had changed in him, because Peter, much like Lynn, he only spoke Mandarin. And even though Melanie had been dealing with Lynn for a while, she still couldn't understand fluent Mandarin, and she didn't have her app ready either. So as Peter was going on and talking fast to her, she said, Sorry, I don't speak Mandarin. And Peter understood right away. He didn't miss a beat. He stopped and pulled out his phone, and he also had a translator app, and he began speaking into it. The words quickly translated to English, and they said, Do you do massage? Melanie just stood there and blinked. And even though she wasn't sure what to say, she wasn't completely surprised. Some of her clients would assume that because she does physical therapy, that must mean that she also does massages. But it wasn't just the question that unsettled her, it was the way that Peter had asked this question. So she answered with caution. Yes, I do some massage therapy. Peter looked down at his phone to see the translation come through, and then he spoke onto it again. Perfect. My brother and I just opened a massage shop. I want you to work for me. Melanie immediately felt weird about this, and she just forced a polite smile and said, Oh, thank you, but I'm happy with my current job. Peter was unfazed by this. His expression didn't change, and he just simply repeated himself again and again, telling her that she was perfect for this job, insisting that she would be great at it, but the compliments didn't feel like flattery to Melanie. They felt scripted, as if he had rehearsed them before. And as she stood there growing increasingly more uncomfortable, she decided to act a little bit more polite, but also pretend that she didn't quite understand the translations. And she kept glancing repeatedly towards the hallway where Lynn should be coming from, just hoping that she would come out and put an end to this conversation so they could start their appointment. Finally, after some time, Lynn came out of the bathroom, and Melanie immediately felt a sense of relief that she wouldn't have to keep talking to Peter. But then Lynn asked her something that she wasn't expecting. Lynn turned to her and in perfect English said, "Are you going to work at the massage shop?" And Melanie just froze, and she said, "No, I'm not." And Lynn did not argue to this. She just gave a faint shrug. Then the appointment began, and it was back to normal as usual. Lynn was following the steps as Melanie directed, but also at the same time, Peter was sitting right behind them on a couch as they were doing their whole session. And even though Melanie was trying to do her job, she was feeling a little weird because she had her back to Peter and she knew that he was there looking at him. So it wasn't like she could just be herself, and everything definitely did not feel how it used to feel. But she tried to tell herself that this was just all harmless. They were simply recruiting for a massage business, and she just wasn't a great fit for it. And she hoped that they would just accept that as her answer. And while they were going about their session, suddenly there was a knock at the door. And without either Peter or Lynn getting up to answer the door, this door just opened on its own, and a guy walked in. He was a man who seemed to be in his 30s or so, and he definitely wasn't invited. And Melanie thought it was just someone walking into their apartment and not invited at all. He happened to be tall and thin, but you couldn't really read his face. He didn't say hi to Lynn or Peter, and he didn't even acknowledge that Melanie was there. He just walked forward and stepped right up close to Melanie. And while Lynn was finishing up her exercise, she just turned and looked up at this new man and said, "What do you think?" This man just looked over at Melanie up and down slowly, then nodded and said, "Beautiful. She's perfect." Every nerve in Melanie's body seemed to scream at her to get moving, but she just sat frozen, unable to process what was happening. Her eyes were going from Lynn to Peter, to this guy, to Lynn, to Peter, to the door. Was this some sort of joke or a prank? Her heart started to pound really fast. The man then sits down next to Peter on the couch. And even though Melanie tried to continue her session with Lynn, she noticed that all three of them just started to speak in Mandarin amongst themselves, really fast, to the point where she couldn't understand, and because she was going through the exercises, she couldn't take out her app to translate any of this. But she did catch a few words here and there, most importantly, her name, her age, and perhaps some information they were sharing about her. It was enough to catch the hints that they were talking about her. She even thinks she caught mentions of her sister, her family members. All information she had at some point shared just in talking with Lynn throughout other appointments previous weeks. At this point, she regretted all that small talk she had had with Lynn, a trusted client. Then this man in his 30s that happened to walk in turned to Melanie and said, "Do you have WhatsApp?" Melanie said, "No, I don't use it." "WeChat?" "No, sorry." He tried a few more apps. Telegram, Instagram, Line, trying to fish for any way he could get her contact information. But Melanie had had enough at this point. She stood abruptly and said, "I'm so sorry, I forgot I had another appointment. I'm gonna have to get going." And she didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her stuff and walked straight out the door. She walked down the hallway into the elevator, pressed the button to go down to the lobby area, stepped out of the building, and basically sprinted to her car. At which point she just sat there trying to calm down, and her heart was still pounding, and she just waited. And while she's sitting there waiting, she sees this man who had just called her perfect and beautiful, the guy in his 30s, also walk out of the building. And she can see him pause, look left and look right, and he doesn't see her, so he just tries to guess where she went, and thankfully he walks the opposite direction of where Melanie went. Either way, Melanie just kind of sinks in her seat, trying to stay hidden from this guy. And as soon as she felt like it was a safe time, she called her manager and told him what had just happened. And her manager was nice about it. In fact, he dropped that client from their list altogether so no other therapist would see them. And to this day, Melanie doesn't know what exactly they wanted. If it was just a business opportunity for being a masseuse, she will never know because they never made that clear to her. And even though they were trying to get her contact information, she was smart enough to not give that out at all, because it definitely seemed very weird, especially with this one guy walking in uninvited, trying to recruit her. But with all of that, all the intrusive questions, all the way they spoke about her, even though she was right there in the room with them, Melanie knew that the best thing that she had done was just trusted her gut. By the time Eliza opened her eyes in her last night in Seoul, South Korea, it was already too late to ignore the gut feeling in her stomach. There was one specific moment when her heart was just pounding on her chest, that every strange encounter from the previous 5 days finally made complete sense. All the signs had been there, she just hadn't let herself see them for what they were. And it all had started so innocently too. You see, Eliza was 21. Fresh off a semester abroad in Japan, and still glowing from the thrill of traveling solo. So she decided to squeeze in a few extra days in Seoul before heading back home. All she had with her was a backpack, a guidebook, and a wide-eyed sense of adventure. She ended up booking a hostel in Gangnam, which is known to be one of the safest and trendiest neighborhoods in the city. The place had glowing reviews, and seemed lively but at the same time cozy. Eliza thought it was the perfect place for a solo traveler like her wanting to meet some new people. When she saw the room that she had booked said it was a mixed dorm, she assumed it would be a blend of men and women. A little unconventional maybe, but she didn't think much of it. She was used to traveling alone, so this wasn't really something out of the ordinary for her. But that changed the moment she stepped into this room and realized that she was the only woman here. But not only that, she was the only woman here sharing a space with 5 unfamiliar men. Still, Eliza tried to stay optimistic. Hostels were social places after all. People came and went. She told herself all she was gonna do anyways was sleep there, because she was gonna be out and about during the days exploring the city, and then she would come home at night and just keep to herself and go to sleep. And besides, she had a chance to talk to a couple of the guys there, and they seemed to be genuinely friendly. Friendly enough that they actually went out to eat some barbecue that night. But one of them, who she started calling Merrick in her mind, let's just say was a little different. From the very beginning, there was something in his eyes that just made her skin crawl. It wasn't obvious, not exactly. He didn't say anything overly strange, but his energy was off. He never really smiled with his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was kind of monotone, like someone who's trying to carefully mimic a normal conversation. At first, Eliza thought that this was just his awkwardness. This guy is just like that. Maybe Merrick was just socially clumsy or severely introverted. She didn't want to be unfair and judge a book by its cover and start jumping to conclusions. So while she did stay polite with Merrick, she also made it a point to stay a little distant. But then the small, strange moments just started to stack on top of each other. There was a tiny vanity in the bathroom that was tucked away in a corner. It was very small. Each morning she would wake up early and go to this vanity to get herself ready for the day. But when she started to apply makeup, she would notice Merrick was behind her because she could see him in the mirror. And he wasn't speaking or moving. He was just looking at her, like he was waiting for her to do something. When she finally turned around and asked, "Do you need anything?" he would just simply shake his head and say, "No." But then he would go right back to staring at her through the mirror. And this got to be so uncomfortable that at some point, Eliza was forced to fake a phone call from a friend so that she could have an excuse to step away from this vanity. That was one thing, but then eventually Merrick started asking weird questions. What are you doing later? Where are you going? Do you want company? When do you plan on showering today? He kept asking her things about her regular routine that were very precise and unsettling. It was almost like he was trying to build a map in his head of her routine and where she would be 24/7. and Eliza would try to give him vague answers so that he wouldn't have a complete picture in his mind about this. And every time Merrick would try to ask her to hang out or do something together, Eliza would decline, and this would cause Merrick to just kind of reply in a flat tone, and you could see in his character that something had shifted and that he definitely didn't like that answer. But the strangest moment came the third night that Eliza had stayed in Seoul. Eliza had spent the morning visiting one of the popular palaces in the city, and she had taken her time. She was basking in the architecture and just the calmness that these stone paths would bring. When it was finally time to go home, she descended into the subway station, where she would take a subway back to the hostel. But when she descended the steps and turned the corner, there was Merrick. He was simply standing in the platform with hands in his pocket, and he looked like he had just been standing there waiting. But he greeted her with a casual surprise like, "Oh, fancy seeing you here." Eliza's stomach sank. Because it wasn't just weird to see him here, the palace that Eliza had been visiting was nowhere near the hostel. So the chances that they would have run into each other at the same exact subway station was 0 to none. But she smiled slightly and she was still trying to be polite, so she told herself, this is nothing, maybe it was just a really weird and unlikely coincidence. Or maybe Eliza herself, was just being paranoid, and she didn't want to accuse someone of being rude, especially when she wasn't even sure herself that this was actually on purpose. She didn't want to be rude, but Eliza should have trusted her gut. The following morning was the tipping point. It was early, around 6:30 in the morning. The room was very dim, the sunlight had just barely started to come through the window, and Eliza happened to kind of shuffle and stir herself awake for a slight moment. And she opened her eyes just a little bit and closed them back again, hoping to try to go back to sleep. But when she opened her eyes again for a second time, she froze. Merrick was sitting right beside her on her bed. He was really close, too close, and he was leaning over her as if he was steadying some sort of painting. His hand gently brushed her jawline, then moved down to her shoulder. The touch was really soft and tender, but Eliza felt like it was ice scraping down her spine. She bolted upright, out of breath, and said, "What the heck are you doing?" Merrick just blinked slowly and said, "You looked peaceful. I didn't want to wake you." Eliza jolted out of bed and sprinted away. She couldn't believe that this was happening and that she had left her guard down this much, that she had shared a room with him, that he had been sitting inches away from her face. She immediately threw all her belongings inside her bag, while Merrick was hovering nearby, kind of following her in a way, still trying to have small talk with her as if nothing had just happened. "You're leaving already?" She lied and said, "I have a flight, but yours isn't until later. I'm checking out now." He followed her around the room, still talking and still smiling as if this was completely normal. I really like you. You barely know me. Sometimes you just know." He continued talking to her and even asked her for her number. She said no, and he asked again and again. He kept pressing for it like it was something he was entitled to. And eventually, just to make him stop, Eliza gave him a fake number, which seemed to kind of put him at ease a little bit, and this allowed Eliza to finally leave the hostel. Something about this whole encounter left her feeling dirty, violated, and just furious with herself that she had allowed it to go this far. She wondered if she had been too polite, or if she just seemed too approachable. But then again, being too firm and blunt with someone like this guy, Merrick, could have possibly provoked him into doing something worse. He just felt unpredictable. And this was the last time Eliza booked a mixed dorm, when she traveled alone. From that day on, if she was going to be traveling solo, she would only be booking dorms with females. But every now and then, even though she hasn't experienced this again, when she wakes up in the middle of the night, she does remember the way this man was touching her jawline and her arm, and it just brings all those memories back again. But that helps her in a way, because she can remember just how long it takes to know a stranger for who they really are.